It's 6 in the morning, my alarm goes off and I wake up. Got my clothes out ready to go to the gym last night, so I'm all prepared and there's absolutely nothing stopping me from my New Year's resolution I gave up in February. Instead, I grab my phone and lose an additional hour scrolling looking at Simpsons with a ball game, AI slop, or Subway Surfers footage. Like many of the chronically online, I've noticed a steady rise in Reels-based content. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and even LinkedIn. You don't have to go far to see short-form content. My story is not unique. Many of my friends will talk about losing hours of time to scrolling, but complain they can't seem to stop. As someone interested in neuropsychology, I was curious to see just what the very recent literature has been saying about the long-term impacts on brain structure and function, which lead us to today's video. Hello Brains Trust. Today on Neurosci we're talking about all things shorts. If you found me from a reel, try turning it off. The revenue is nice and all, but yeah, some of the stuff coming out of the research world makes you think. Let's get some orientation first. From a brain structural point of view, increased scrolling behavior was associated with alterations in grey matter beyond typical development in the orbitofrontal cortex and cerebellum. Although the cerebellum has been traditionally thought to be associated with fine movement control, recent literature has highlighted its role in cognitive processes such as attention and emotional processing. I want to focus on the orbitofrontal cortex, this part right here. These changes after scrolling were hypothesized to reflect a shift towards immediate gratification and reduced self-control capabilities, and has similarly been observed in drug addiction. It's not just the orbitofrontal cortex either. Research has also implicated alterations in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This region is involved in planning, judgment, and decision-making. In addition to changes in brain structure, we can also see changes in networks and connectivity between regions. Repeated exposure to short-form video content tires out the brain's reward systems, these being the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways, and leads to a gradual shift away from goal-directed behavior and towards more immediate gratification. These reward systems consist of the ventral tegmental area. When something is perceived as pleasurable or motivating, it prompts activation in this region. The VTA releases dopamine, which binds to the nucleus accumbens, which further leads to dopamine release and, more importantly, feelings of pleasure. Dopamine is not just released in response to something good. It's a neurotransmitter involved in want, motivation, and novelty. The brain craves newness. Going back to scrolling, with newness, the reward circuit lights up in the same way to something that feels good like food. There is an also added addictive element. The most potent type of rewards are the ones that can't be predicted. These original studies here were popular by B.F. Skinner and his rats. Basically, a rat was trained to pull a lever and then received a food pellet. What Skinner found was that the rat that was only sometimes given the food was more likely to continue pulling the lever, as opposed to when it was continuously reinforced. Now come back to reels. Sometimes the reel is funny and informative. Other times it just wastes your time and you get annoyed. Here it's a similar mechanism. Sometimes the reel is good, but most times they're not going to be that enjoyable. Over time, scrolling becomes more automatic and a habit. Habits develop from the basal ganglia, a collection of nuclei in the midbrain that leads a shift away from controlled, conscious behavior in the prefrontal regions towards more habit-driven behavior. The basal ganglia include the nucleus accumbens and indirectly activates the striatum, otherwise known as the caudate and putamen. This activation begins to happen in the context of cues in the environment, such as seeing your phone rather than explicit behavior of using your phone, and is involved in the shift from goal-directed behavior to habit behavior. Gradually, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex loses its relevance in coordinating behavior, whereas the orbitofrontal cortex becomes more active, effectively bypassing controlled, goal-directed behavior that the dorsolateral cortex is involved in. So that leads the question to, cognitively, what does excessive scrolling do to our thinking? Well, that comes back to the brain structures and networks that are affected after lots of scrolling. Across neuropsychological testing, young adults' working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information in your head, is negatively affected. Your ability to learn new information is also affected, which leads to increased forgetting, particularly for later tasks as the information does not get into your brain. Attention, as well as an interesting concept, increases in short-form video consumption was associated with greater difficulties in sustained attention and distractibility. On a higher level, increased short video form consumption has been associated with more abstract cognitive skills, such as shallower cognitive processing and reduced decision-making efficiency. Looking back at the impacted brain regions and networks, this all makes sense. These frontal regions are associated with cognitive control and attention. By essentially training our brain on more immediate rewards, our ability to execute these behaviors over time becomes more challenged. An obvious downside to this science is that it's all very new. Research on this topic has only really come out over the past 4 years or so. There is also the fact that most of this research is correlational, which means we can't determine for sure whether attention is impacted by short-form video use, or people with low attention prefer to engage with short-form video content. We can't establish direction. That being said, the overall gist from several reviews now seems to be that short-form video consumption is at least associated with difficulties in cognitive control, attention, and memory. Changing topics now, have you ever thought about how scrolling may impact a developing brain? Most of the research is focused on university students. In research, these are samples that are the easiest to capture and do research with. Plus, it's unethical to put a toddler through hours of reels to see what happens to their brain. However, mice studies and some human studies have shown that earlier media exposure has led to behavioral and cognitive challenges in brain regions associated with increased impulsivity and attention differences which persist over time. At a neuroscience level, children's brains undergo massive changes and can be impacted by the environment. Things like stress and trauma, particularly during the first 3 years, can have profound developmental impacts. When we're born, the brain overproduces neurons and gradually refines itself over time. Most research suggests that this doesn't finish until our early 20s, when those frontal regions are refined the most. This means our brains are very vulnerable to environmental impacts within those periods. This is why things like Cocomelon concern me. These shows are deliberately designed to rapidly change. Every few seconds there'll be a cut to a different camera angle. This is intentional. It's designed to maintain attention. In a New York Times article by David Siegel, he reported the company that made Cocomelon, Moonbug Entertainment, will have research days where they will place a toddler in a room with a television and a second smaller screen. This second smaller screen has a person doing an interesting task like making a coffee. Basically, when the child looks away from the main screen, away from the Moonbug show, to look at the smaller screen, affectionately named the distraction, the research team makes a note. They now know when to introduce a cut in the show so that the toddler does not need to look away for next time. The New York Times article does not go into too much detail about the potential negatives to this, but another blog post by Prasna Gautam explains further with comparison to Australian icon and national hero Bluey the difference in the shows. Basically, Bluey is less stimulating than Cocomelon and I would argue has less potential to be cognitively demanding. There's been limited research over time looking at these impacts on a developing brain, but it does make me wonder what the long-term consequences of living in a short-field world may be. But Cocomelon is old news. What does the next era of short-form video look like? I think we can already see it, and it's AI generated. I recently stumbled across that AI Fruit Love Island, videos that are AI generated with scripts that are so uncomfortable to look at. As Australian professors explain, these reels offer the rapid visual novelty that we've come to expect with this type of content, as well as some uncanny valley that makes it difficult to look away from. This is the type of content that our reward system loves to get addicted to. However, the sheer volume and speed of this stuff means it can be put out quickly and quietly tweaked to optimize engagement. Frankly, I don't want to give these affronts to human creativity any more screen time or present, so let's move on to discussing how we actually stop the rot. Unfortunately, because the topic is so new in the science literature, the strategies to stop its domination over our brains is also still developing. However, early evidence points towards the following. Quitting cold turkey may be very difficult to start with, so research has supported the initial use of limits. Other strategies are aimed at making the content visually less interesting. Things like putting your phone on grayscale may also reduce screen time. Creating distance as well for the purpose of breaking the habit cycle is also important. So yes, keep the phone away from the bed and impose screen time limits. Lastly, in behavioral science, you can't just stop a behavior, it needs to be replaced by something. It's not enough to just stop scrolling, you need to swap that behavior with something else. In this case, as cliche as it sounds, yes, going outside, sport, and maintaining offline friendships is the way forward. So, taking it all together, what have we learned here? We've gone through the key brain regions and networks associated with watching short form content. These regions are mostly in the prefrontal cortex involved in goal-directed behavior. We've also covered the reward system, dopamine, and the habit systems and how these interact with frontal systems. We've reviewed the cognitive impacts on attention, memory, and higher order skills such as decision making and impulse control. We've touched on a few more relevant examples, and lastly discussed some strategies to cut back on scrolling. And that was the Neuropsy of the TikTok brain. Thanks for watching.